Hello, my friends. Douglas C. Gibbs here, Mr. Constitution. Welcome to this video. And, I wrote an article about this not too long ago when I saw this article, but in the Epoch Times. But I decided, what, I need to do a video about this too. This is about executive orders, and executive orders is always a concern, always a question. But the interesting thing is, in this case, is the article from the Epoch Times explains how the GOP-controlled state legislatures, or a number of them in the United States, are seeking to review the constitutionality of presidential executive orders, meaning the President of the United States, and if they are, unconstitutional, or they deem them to be unconstitutional, then they will refuse to abide by them. That's nullification. Now, really, nullification is about unconstitutional laws. Has the legislature passed and has the president signed laws that are not constitutional? Executive orders are not legally binding. So executive orders against the states actually are not supposed to exist anyway. Any executive order against a state is unconstitutional and should be nullified. In other words, refuse to be followed. Now, let's do a real quick background, a little bit of talk about what executive orders are, and then hopefully you'll understand. So, Article 1, Section 1 of the United States Constitution reads that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. So, all legislative powers are the power to create law, modify law, or repeal law. So only Congress can create law. In other words, something is not law unless it's gone through the legislative process. Legislative powers begins always with Congress. So anything that has not gone through the legislative process does not have the power of law. Now, an executive order, because it's by the president, a member of the executive branch, then would hold no power of law. Article 1, Section 1, once again says that the legislative branch has all legislative powers. Congress has all legislative powers. So that means any executive order issued has no power of law. Executive orders historically have basically two functions. One, to send instructions down through the executive branch on how to execute a law, or if to execute a law, or the means and manner or which department to execute a law, and a proclamation. For example, the Thanksgiving Proclamation by George Washington, or the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln, or the Proclamation for a National Day of Prayer by Ronald Reagan. They're all proclamations. They're not legally binding. They don't put into law anything. You're not required to pray by law on the National Day of Prayer because of a proclamation based on an executive order by a president. When George Washington, established his proclamation, Thanksgiving Proclamation, it was not you're required to give thanks on that day. It was a proclamation. It said, hey, this is something we ought to do, country. This is my recommendation. I'm calling for this. But this is not legally binding because it did not go through the legislative process. So now if a state is asked to do something, it has to be through law and it has to be constitutional. Now remember, when the federal government was created through the Constitution, the states had all original authority, and they created a system where they had oversight over this federal government. The states maintained much of their sovereignty and autonomy, especially when it comes to domestic issues. The federal government was created to handle external issues, war, trade with other countries, commerce with other countries, and between the states, if it is not flowing properly. That's a different conversation for a different time. That's the federal government's duties. So for the federal government to dictate to a state through law anything, first of all, is likely unconstitutional, especially if it's done by an executive order. Once again, executive orders don't have power of law. So now what we're talking about when it comes to these GOP-controlled state legislatures saying, hey, we've got to review these executive orders, see if they're legally binding. Are they, or do they follow the law? An executive order saying in which, let's say, the legislature passed a law that all of the post offices are going to do a certain thing in a certain manner, and the state says, well, I don't know, is that executive order to carry out that law constitutional? Well, if it's to carry out a law that exists, then the state ought to follow it, unless the law itself is unconstitutional. But if an executive order is calling out for something that's not been passed as a law, perhaps a mandate or an edict regarding certain items that have been in recent history, say 2020 and 2021, well, that's a mandate or an edict, but it has no power of law. Executive branch cannot make law. An executive order is not legally binding. And so if any state legislature says, whoa, wait a second, the president is trying to order us to do something with an executive order to carry out his will, and there's no law behind it, then we don't have to follow it. The very idea that the state legislatures have to weigh the constitutionality of presidential executive orders in those cases is actually kind of ridiculous. They have no power of law. You don't have to do what the president tells you. He's not a ruler. He's not the king. Once again, executive orders can carry out existing pieces of legislation. Once again, most legislation domestically is unconstitutional in the first place, but once again, that's another conversation for another time. But for the states to go, gosh, the president issued this particular executive order to force this particular mandate on us to make us wear a medical device on our face or receive a particular injection or something like that. Was there a law? No. Well, we don't have to do it. You don't need the very fact that the state legislatures are confused. Well, we got to weigh the constitutionality. No, it's not legally binding. Article 1, Section 1. All legislative powers herein granted are vested in a Congress. President has no power to do anything that's legally binding, nor do the courts. And the fact that the states are confused on this, that they actually have to, we better have a committee to determine whether or not that's constitutional. Don't follow it. Executive orders against a state, ordering a state to do something, typically are not constitutional. Once again, if there is a constitutional piece of legislation that was passed by Congress and signed by the president, that is being executed with an executive order, that's different. Everything else, not even close to being constitutional. Hopefully this clears that up. Thank you for the article, Epic Times. I'm glad they're looking into some of these issues. I am Douglas V. Gibbs, Mr. Constitution, douglasvgibbs.com, politicalpistachio.com. And what I do, I have 2 radio programs that I host, one on KMET on Saturdays from 1 to 3 Pacific, and one on KPRZ down in San Diego on Saturday nights at 9 p.m. Pacific. That one's also on all of the podcast platforms. You name it, it's on there. Odyssey, Audible, Spotify, you name it. iHeart, Amazon, Listen Notes, Apple. It's on all of them. Just look up Mr. Constitution Hour by Douglas V. Gibbs and you'll get all the past episodes. But all of that costs money. The podcasting, the videos, the classes, everything I do, there is a funding mechanism that's required. So as we get past Christmas, we enter 2023. That's when this video was first recorded. One more gift is needed. You got your family, you got your friends. Now, you got to get your teacher. So go to douglasvgibbs.com or politicalpistachio.com. Find the donate button. We're always looking for help. All right, united we stand, combined we kick butt. God bless America, my friends. God bless you. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell there on this video page, whichever one you're watching on. And, of course, if you want to subscribe to my email list, go to douglasvgibbs.com or politicalpistachio.com, and you can also find a link to join the email list. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. God bless.